I'm going to very quickly, I'm Mary Curtin, and I'm a diplomat in residence here at the Humphrey School, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who probably doesn't need much introduction here. I think, as a lot of you know, she served more than 3 decades as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department, serving as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, as Director General of the Foreign Service, as Ambassador to Liberia, and in many positions dealing with humanitarian issues, especially refugee issues around the world. And we've heard a lot this morning about role models. And as a former Foreign Service officer myself, it really is an honor to have here someone who was a role model for many, many men and women of color and not of color in the State Department over her decades of service. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Welcome her back to the Humphrey School. Thanks.
I don't know where to start. You know, I have, when I do speeches, and particularly when I'm writing them myself, thank you, Mary. When I'm writing them myself, I rewrite them until I deliver it. So I'm going to be rewriting the speech as we talk, having listened to all of you today. This has just been extraordinary. And I can't think of a better place to spend International Women's Day than with all of you here today, hearing your stories and hearing about your families and really identifying with all of the stories that you've told. So I'm going to look down for a minute so that I can express my thank yous and not forget to thank all of you for being here, but thank particularly Dean Bloomberg for inviting me, to thank Fatun and your team for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to speak with all of you today. You know, as you were speaking, and particularly this last group, I don't know the extent to which those of you who came here as Somali refugees know how much I have been involved in your lives. I started out as a refugee coordinator working on refugee issues in Washington, working on our resettlement program many, many years ago, probably when most of you were either not born or you were small children. And my first job in refugees was to help bring up the numbers of African refugees we were bringing to the United States, and that number was 2,000. And we couldn't meet the ceiling. And my job was to meet the ceiling of 2,000. And notice I said ceiling. And in 1989, I failed because I brought in 1,982 refugees, and I missed that ceiling just by a few, and I felt so disappointed. But one of the things that I accomplished before I left that job was to bring that ceiling up to 25,000. 10 times more. I'm rewriting the speech here, guys. And I would go on to eventually live in Kenya as the refugee coordinator in Kenya. And I don't know if there's anybody who started their lives out to the United States from Dadaab refugee camp. So I've spent many, many days of my life in Dadaab refugee camp, trying to figure out how we could find a permanent solution for the people who were living in those 3 camps in Kenya. There were about 120,000 refugees back in 1989, and I've recently learned that that number is over 400,000 now. So I failed again in finding a solution to that refugee crisis, but I have to tell you, all of us will continue to try. Now I'll go back to my speech. So the global theme of this year's celebration is pressing for progress. And this is an extraordinarily powerful theme given the environment that we are in today, when the progress that we've worked so hard to achieve is being compromised and questioned and pushed back, particularly for women of African descent. Your theme, promoting and supporting women of African descent, is equally relevant as we see African women, women of African descent rising, but also, as you've heard today, continuing to face immense challenges in health and in education, in the public sector, in the private sector. And these issues you've covered, I think, so well today that I don't really need to go into them. But there are two things that struck me as I heard the discussion going on today. The first is that in 2018, we are still having this discussion about the role of women and the need to promote and support women of African descent. And secondly, in 2018, we still need to have this discussion, particularly as it relates to supporting women of African descent. So again, this is such a relevant topic that you have for us today. We women, both of African descent and others, have come a long ways since in 1972, when 10 years before I joined our Foreign Service, women who were married in our diplomatic corps had to quit. They had to leave their jobs. This has been my field of endeavor, so I feel more comfortable talking about this. The numbers of African American women in the Foreign Service at that time, you probably could count on one hand and probably would not have to use all of your fingers. We've come a long way since in 1981, when Sandra Day O'Connor was nominated by President Reagan as the first woman on the Supreme Court, and now there are three, one of whom is of Hispanic descent. And we've come a long way since the first woman was appointed Secretary of State under Bill Clinton in 1996, Madeleine Albright, who is my current employer, who has gone on to start a successful commercial diplomacy business, to be followed by the first African-American woman to be named Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who was appointed by President Bush, and then Hillary Clinton, who was appointed by President Obama. And the reason I'm going through all of this is because it is women in positions of power, whether it's our Supreme Court, it's our Department of State or other departments in the United States, who will bring the issues of women to the forefront. Globally, there have been about 160 women elected as heads of state and government, including my good friend Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, who just made history by turning her country over after 12 years of rule to a democratically elected president. And Ellen, as we like to call her, was the first woman to be elected president in Africa, and that was in 2006. There was a second one, Joyce Banda, but right now at this moment, there's not a single woman head of state in Africa. But in 2016, 2 years ago, in the United States, we could not elect our first woman president. And we're still discussing whether it's the right time to have a woman president in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the right time. And why not a woman of African descent? So let me say again, we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, particularly as it relates to women achieving economic parity to our male colleagues. I just learned from a young woman who was doing research on this issue over the weekend who called me that in the private sector, at senior levels, this is senior levels of the private sector, women still only earn 80 cents to a man's dollar. But imagine that figure, what that figure must be in Africa and among African Americans. So again, let me say, we have a long ways to go. On the positive side, since Madam C.J. Walker, the first Black woman to be declared a millionaire, developed her own line of Black hair products that we're all using today in some form or another, we've come a long way. We have women of African descent in businesses across the board and across the globe in every sector, successfully navigating the entrepreneurial world and opening doors for new opportunities for other women of African descent. I've gotten to know a dynamic young woman, and I want you guys to remember her name. She's an American of Ghanaian descent, Rahama Wright, and she's developed and is successfully marketing her own brand of shea butter products, Shea Aline. And these products are now being sold in Whole Food stores in the Washington area. And I know that Rahama is going to go nationwide and global. But she needs all of your support. This is about supporting each other. And we need to support her and others like her who have dared to start their own businesses so that they can become our next generation of millionaires. That's how they get supported. So again, I've been rewriting this speech, so let me go back to really what I came here to talk to you about during this short period that I have with you today, is to kind of share some advice and some strategies on how women of African descent can support efforts to lift up women and build networks that are supportive in every field of endeavor. And while I'm focusing on women of African descent, I think what I'm sharing with you today has really global relevance and can be used by women across the board. I always tell my class that I go by the rule of 5. I'll come up with a list of 5, and that doesn't mean my list is all-inclusive, but I figure 5 is what you can write down fast, and it's what you can remember if you're not writing. So I always come up with a list of 5. So I'm going to share with you 5 of my recommendations for how we women of African descent can be supportive of each other. If I might paraphrase my old boss and the first woman to be elected by a major party to run for president, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and she ought to be president. She said that when you invest in women, they invest in others. They send their kids, particularly their girls, to school. They invest in their families. They invest in their communities. They pay back. So my first advice and strategy is that we must pay back. We must look back to lift up people behind us. We must mentor and support each other. We must ensure that we, who have been successful in every field of endeavor, that we help other women to achieve success as well. And this kind of reminds me of the crab theory, and all of you have heard it. You've heard the metaphor of the crabs in the bucket or the pot of boiling water, who all could escape if the ones lower down didn't pull them back. I have the opposite of that. The opposite side of that is that instead of being pulled down by the people at the bottom of the bucket, the crabs at the bottom of the bucket, imagine if the crabs at the top look back, look down, and pull people up. So the crab theory can be looked at in different ways. We women must look back. We must look back to pull others up with us, and particularly in Africa and among the African American community, who continue in almost every endeavor to be second-class citizens. But there are some of us who are at the top, and it is our responsibility at the top of this boiling pot to look down and pull those people behind us up with us. One of the key equalizers for women and girls, and we've talked about this today, whether it's in Africa or in the US or other places in the world, is education. And I read a recent report that stated, providing girls with good education is vital for a country's development. When women are equipped with learning and share decisions about families and livelihoods, the productivity of the society rises. When I was ambassador to Liberia a few years ago, I spoke at a local high school. In fact, it was a very small village high school. And as I was speaking, what I was struck by was the excitement of the mothers in the room. They were dancing and they were cheering and they were shouting. And so rewriting my speech like I always do, I looked up at the mothers and I said, how many of you mothers can read and write? And there was silence. And people looked down, and nobody raised their hand, and it was like I had doused them with a bucket of cold water. Their enthusiasm died, and none of them raised their hands. And I realized for a moment that I'd made a mistake. Seeing their embarrassment, I shared with them my own story of my own mother, who, like them, had been at my graduation, her first daughter graduating from high school, with tremendous excitement. And herself never having graduated from high school, married to a man who was totally illiterate, my father. My mother would go back to high school and get her high school diploma nearly 20 years after I got my high school diploma. It took her 20 years to do it, but she did it. She did it, and that's what I shared with those women in the room, and I encouraged the students, their children, to set up an adult literacy program for their parents and to educate their mothers. That was in 2009. I am still getting messages from this school of the hundreds of women that have learned, have gone on and gotten high school diplomas, and who can read and write because their children look back and taught them to do that. And imagine that, how much that community is building and growing. Imagine the power that these women who had enough power to make sure that their kids were educated, imagine their power now that they are educated. This is about looking back and pulling others up. My second recommendation and strategy is that we must look for opportunities to make a difference in our families, in our communities, and our nation. And every single one of you in this room have done that. I heard it as I listened to speakers. I heard it as I listened to questions. This is a bit of advice that you don't need from me. You're already doing that. Whether you're volunteering in a local school, being a big sister to someone who is less fortunate than you. There are so many girls who are in our community who just need a nod of approval. They just need a helping hand. And we all need to look for those opportunities. I think, was it you, Judge, someone said we should tell our stories. So the person you see standing here in front of you today, and I always talk about this in terms of the first chapters of your life do not necessarily define what the last chapters of your life will look like. I grew up in an extraordinarily poor family, in a poor community. Imagine an uneducated black man and an uneducated black woman with 8 children. And so poverty was part of my existence. But why am I here today? I'm here because somebody along the way gave me a nod. Somebody along the way thought that there was some possibility, thought that I deserved their attention. And there were many somebodies like that in my life who looked for the opportunity to make a difference to me in my life. And I have paid that back many times over and continue to. But we also must continue to look for opportunities to support each other. We must look for opportunities to support Black businesses. We must buy Rahama Wright's Shea Helene products, because I know that what she is doing is not all about her. She's buying shea butter from women in Ghana who were probably getting pennies for their product until she put together this business package that included the women getting better paid for their product. So we must work to support each other. Third, you got the other two, right? Third, we have to be role models. How many of you have seen the picture that I heard went viral of the little 2-year-old looking at the picture of Michelle Obama? It was just amazing. It brought tears to my eyes. My eyes are watering up now just thinking of that little girl. So here's what being a role model does for you. That is what it does for our children, that they can see other people who look like them, who have their same skin color, who have their same hair texture, being successful. They need to see women who look like them. They need to define beauty in their own terms. To support others, you must be a person that a young person wants to model themselves after. In Liberia, little girls now know that they can be president. Imagine that. They know that they can be president. All over Africa, little girls know because of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf that they can be a president. That's very powerful. My fourth recommendation is stand up. Don't wait for others to do it. And that was said here today as well. So I didn't need to give this speech. It's in everybody's comments. Do it yourself. Do it yourself. Don't wait for other people to do it for you. I don't have to explain this, but when I think about the women's movement, I think about the march in Washington in January of 2017 that brought thousands of women in Washington, millions of women who stood up all over the United States and all over the world to fight for women's rights. And I was really buoyed by that. We as women must continue to stand up. We cannot be silent in the face of our realities. When the Black Lives Matter movement stood up after several high-profile shootings of Black men, I too, a mother of a Black boy, realized that I had to stand up too. So here I was, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and I wake up early one morning, and this is after the shooting that took place here in Minnesota, when I watched this young Black man sitting in his car seat, bleeding to death, while his girlfriend and her little girl watched. And I realized that I could be the mother of that child, that man, that could have been my son. And so I walked into my office that morning, like, this is not going to be a regular day for me. I had a regular 8:30 in the morning staff meeting where we came together to talk about all the things that were happening in Africa, whether it was the kidnapping of girls in Boko Haram, the fighting in South Sudan, the conflict in Central African Republic, and none of that mattered to me that morning. The only thing that mattered to me is that I wanted to talk about what was happening to our young Black men. And I'd gotten an email a text message from my nephew, who was a policeman. And he said to me, "Auntie, it's hard out there. When I'm in my uniform, I have a bullseye on my back, and when I'm out of my uniform, I have a bullseye on my back. I'm not sure what to do." So I was an angry Black woman. I was an angry mother. And I walked in and I said, "I want to talk about this." And someone said, "Well, it doesn't really have any resonance for diplomacy." And I thought, oh, but it does. It does. So I started what I called a conversation on race in the State Department. And nobody wanted, everybody was doing this, like, what is she doing? And I started it in a small kind of gathering of my senior staff. And I told them, I'm an angry Black mother today because I know that Black boy could have been my son. And so we talked about it, and what came out of this, hearing from my white colleagues, when I said to them, when my son goes out, my son is a successful Black man. BMW is what they call them, Black man working. But every single day, if my phone rings, I'm scared that something has happened to him. And, if he goes out to dinner at night, I'm afraid that I want to talk to him on the phone every single day. And my white friends said, I never think about that when my sons go out. I don't hear from them for 2 weeks at a time. And I don't think about it. If I don't hear from my son every night, there's trouble, because I'm worried something has happened to him. And that's what we all, as Black mothers, go through every single day. That's part of our existence, it's part of our lives. It doesn't matter what class you are, it doesn't matter how successful your children are, it doesn't matter where you live. You worry about this every single day. Well, this conversation on race became a huge deal. We took it abroad. I took it to South Africa, where I sat with a group of people saying, do you people ever talk about race? It was a taboo subject. You live it, but you don't talk about it. We have to talk about it because it's part of our everyday lives. You know it, and you feel it, and you understand it. Today, as we sit comfortably in this room, ladies and gentlemen, hundreds, if not thousands, of young girls in Nigeria are being held captive by Boko Haram. The most recent attack, when more than 100 girls were taken, didn't even get a peep on the news. I got a call from BBC wanting to talk about it, and when I walked in, and it was a week later, normally these things happen, I get calls immediately. And they said, why didn't anybody talk about this? And I said to them, why are you not reporting on this? Because it doesn't matter. Black lives do matter. And we have to make sure. My first tweet this morning, and I'm not a prolific tweeter, but I've sent out 3 tweets today, 2 of them since I've been sitting in this room. But my first tweet today was that as we commemorate International Women's Day, we not forget those girls. Because imagine the suffering that they are experiencing right now, only because they wanted to be educated and their parents wanted to educate them. So we cannot forget those girls. We need to stand up, ladies. We need to stand up. So my 5th and final one, and this was talked about today as well. Like I said, I didn't need to give this speech. My final strategy is vote. And not just in presidential elections, but you need to vote in local elections. That's exactly what's on my paper. You need to vote for your city councilman. You need to vote for your school boards. You need to vote for your state legislators. You need to vote for your governors. All of these, and county commissioners. You need to vote, period. You need to vote. Your vote counts. Imagine if Black women had not voted in the election in Alabama. We would have a racist child molester sitting in the Senate. Do you think that he would support issues that benefit women and girls? No. Imagine the Virginia gubernatorial election, where Black women voted in record numbers and delivered that election to the Democratic candidate. And I'm not telling you what party to vote for. I'm not partisan. Well, not too much. I used to not be partisan. I'm a little partisan now. But what I'm saying to you is that your vote matters regardless of the party you are from. We must galvanize our voting power into a strong interest group, and candidates must know if they seek our vote, they want our support to be elected, they have to earn that vote. There was a state election in Virginia between a Republican and Democratic candidate. The Democratic candidate was a woman. She lost it by one vote. One vote. Every vote counts. Every vote counts. I had an experience when Obama was running for the Democratic nomination, and we had a primary in Virginia. And normally I get up to go vote at 6 o'clock in the morning. I line up early in the morning, but that morning I was running late, so I decided I would wait until the evening. And the polls closed at 7. My husband picked me up from work at 5:30, and there was an ice storm. And I literally, I live 5 miles from my office. And the voting place is near my house. We were 1 block from the voting place at 7 o'clock when the polls closed. I didn't vote. And I have learned a valuable lesson from that: go in the morning. You don't know what's going to happen in the evening. And fortunately, it wasn't one vote that he needed, but it could have been. So it really is important to organize yourselves to vote, and try to get others to vote as well. Get your neighbors. Take your neighbors out with you. Take your children. I mean, young people, this millennial generation didn't feel it was important to vote. You know, my son was like, Hillary got it. I don't need to vote. I got him out of bed at 5:30 in the morning and took him out to vote. You know, you have to be politically involved. You know, I was in a taxi in Los Angeles during the election, and I had this Somali taxi driver who said to me he couldn't vote for a woman. He was voting for Trump. And so I said to him, when he puts you back on a plane to go home, remember Linda. And I know he's remembering me now. He might already be back on a plane. But again, I'm trying not to be partisan. Voting is important. And I will quote, who was it that said this? One of our speakers, Clara. Where are you, Clara? Did she leave? Okay, Clara was the one who said, if you're not at the table, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And what that means is you need to vote. And you need to meet your politicians. You need to go and talk to them. You need to draft bills and participate in the process. It's not enough to complain. It's not enough to be miserable. It's not enough to be a victim. You have to be an active victim so that you can change the trajectory of what is happening in your lives. Let me end with the theme we started with for International Women's Day and the theme for the conference. If we are to promote and support women of African descent, we must continue pressing for progress. We cannot stand on the sidelines and allow the progress that we have achieved be lost because of complacency. And finally, I have to tell you that I am a perpetual optimist. My glass is always half full. And for those of you who've seen the Black Panther movie and the powerful roles played by women of African descent in that movie, Wakanda's imaginary success is possible for Africa, for women of African descent, both here and all over the world. Let's stand up and press forward. Thank you.